There are a few Lord of the Rings theories that had already experienced some bursts of popularity during the lead up to the premiere, but became far, far more popular after that premiere occurred. One of these theories is the idea that the stranger, whom we call Meteor Man, is actually a character we know. I think this is likely, but of course the question is, who is this character? The most reasonable sounding of these theories I've heard is that this character is Gandalf. Of course, you can hardly blame the show for wanting to have Gandalf in it. He's one of the most iconic and beloved characters in the trilogy, and having a young Gandalf would be as alluring to the producers as having a young Galadriel. It has some dramatic potential as it allows us to showcase earlier versions of characters we already know and see how they became the people they are by the events of The Lord of the Rings, but it also has brand and commercial potential as it allows fans to latch on to characters they're already familiar with. Now, there is no Gandalf in Tolkien's version of the events that go on in the times that are discussed here in the Rings of Power show, but that's not really the most significant thing in the world, and if that's the most robust argument to this character not being Gandalf, I think the odds of them being Gandalf are much greater. The show has already proved itself willing to undergo a lot of narrative compression of all the various decades and centuries that Tolkien sets up for all these events to occur in. Now, an equally common and more controversial theory is the idea that Halbrand, whom we've been introduced to, is secretly Sauron, the vile, manipulative, and devilishly clever Dark Lord who is far much more of a direct presence in the Second Age than he will become during the Third, when he's just this presence haunting the land, symbolized in the Peter Jackson movies in the eye, flaming red and bright on the top of Barad-dûr, looking for anyone who is trying to disrupt his control and authority. Now, there are a number of reasons why this theory is so controversial. A vocally loud minority of the fandom does not want to see any changes from the source material, which I think is rather backwards-looking, ridiculous, and narrow-minded. Even the Lord of the Rings trilogy made a lot of changes to the Lord of the Rings book, and that book was much more conventionally narratively organized than the collection of stories and appendices on which the Rings of Power show is based. They've already been doing a lot of compression and a lot of switching around. Changing the identity of a character like Sauron is not completely absurd, especially when it's done for a thematic and philosophical purpose, which it is here, if indeed Halbrand is Sauron. In the books, the guy Sauron appears in is Annatar. He tempts the elves, he's charming and affable, he gets himself invited into their confidences. They trust him. They believe that he's on their side and he genuinely cares for their well-being. But since we, the audience, already know that that happens, having him be Annatar would create a major disconnect between the elves who are tricked by his wiles and the audience who already knows Annatar is Sauron. So Sauron is likely going to take a different guise because he has to create an atmosphere wherein we, the audience, experience the same sense of initial pleasure and delight at Sauron's charms, followed by the eventual recognition of his true nature too late, after the betrayal has already happened, that the elves undergo. So he's going to take a different guise in the show, which is fine, and that guise is probably going to be who, if not Halbrand. That said, it's not like the only reason people don't like the Halbrand is Sauron theory is because they're hardcore fundamentalist purists. There are people who just don't like the character of Halbrand. They think he's too similar to Aragorn already, but lacking the preternatural wisdom and reassurance that emanates from Viggo Mortensen's virtuoso performance as Aragorn in the movies. Other people just think it would be way too obvious to have Halbrand be Sauron. I'm not quite sure about this, but The Lord of the Rings as a franchise is not exactly traded on a lot of subtlety. There are some aspects that are nuanced, such as the conflicts between what is right, what is moral, what is good, and the practical realities that present themselves and make it very difficult to make those right choices. That's Tolkien at his best, demonstrating why people err off the side of the righteous and selfless path while still urging that they try their best to remain committed to their moral ideals. But we're not in Game of Thrones world. We're not in your ordinary domestic mid-century realist drama. We're in an elevated world. A lack of subtlety is not necessarily a bad thing. Perhaps the most interesting objection I've heard is that having Halbrand be Sauron would undermine Galadriel's story, because in the show she is very close to Halbrand. She forms a strong relationship with him, as is already demonstrated in the first couple episodes. There is a sense of warmth and intrigue in the connection between them. And if Halbrand is Sauron and he's just playing Galadriel, that would not reflect well on Galadriel's judgment, and thus be contrary to the core of Galadriel's role in the Sauron Second Age story in the original Tolkien lore, because in that lore she is the only one who sees right through Sauron's sly, charming manipulations. Obviously, if the relationship between these two ends up being romantic, then it would be quite disquieting for Galadriel to be in a relationship like that with Sauron. But even if it's not, just the fact of Galadriel forming a close friendship with him does not reflect well on her. Aristotle talks a lot about how the kinds of friendships we make reflect the kinds of people we are. And a big part of being good, on following the righteous and morally fulfilling path, is being able to discern the right kinds of friendships to have. The highest kinds of friendships are not those of utility or of mere pleasure. They're the kinds of friendships that exist in the realm of the good, and that can only exist between two people who are committed to the good beyond their own material self-interest or their own personal caprices. The best kinds of friendships are, for Aristotle, about willing the good in yourself and the other by means of these strong, solid friendships that are far less transient or prone to breaking apart or fading than the other kinds of friendships based on passing, transient, inevitably fading pleasures and delights. So if Galadriel cannot realize that the person she has this bond with is a wicked manipulator that does not reflect well on her moral character. Nonetheless, it is not like this whole theory is baseless. Quite the contrary, a major reason why people are worried for it is that the theory does seem plausible in terms of the narrative. The prominence of Halbrand in this story is, I think, a bit outsized to the relatively normal character that he seems to be. If he is not anyone special, if he is just Halbrand, then I think the show would be hard-pressed to justify why it's spending so much time on him as opposed to all the other characters. Sure, there are other invented characters in the show. It's not all characters pulled directly from Tolkien lore or characters we've seen before in the Lord of the Rings movies. We have the Harfoots, for instance, but they're very much the equivalent of the hobbits in the trilogy. If the hobbits were not such beloved characters in the Lord of the Rings movies, I doubt the Harfoots would be of such preeminence here. Halbrand is an exception. We don't know what role he's going to play. We don't know much about him, and we also don't know in what guise Sauron is going to appear. So it's reasonable to think that he is Sauron. And also there's one last intriguing piece of evidence that comes down to musical cues. I saw this on Reddit and I think it is so clever. It could just be a coincidence, but I doubt it. The Sauron musical cue, his grand leitmotif, played backward, is almost exactly the same as the Halbrand motif. I was just so giddy when I found that out. Bear McCreary, the show's composer, if that was intentional, that was very clever of you. If it's not intentional, it's a major coincidence that someone on Reddit managed to find out that comparison. I highly doubt it's meaningless. But whether this theory is good or not, whether it's something I want to see happen or not, is not really something I can say at this point. You can like it or you can dislike it. I'm not really here to judge either way. I really haven't made up my mind yet. I'll need more of the show to pass before I can. I'm just here to lay all the facts and analyses down on the table and allow y'all to come to your own conclusions. I think the theory is definitely at least plausible. So thank y'all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more videos like this. Before anyone else, keep watching The Rings of Power. What mysteries do you think will be unveiled in the last 6 episodes of the show? What kinds of intriguing stories and contemplative and bold and ambiguous moments is the show going to cultivate? I can't wait to see. Anyway, tune in soon for our next analysis. It will be coming relatively quickly. I promise you all that. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.